Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. I'm your host, Brian from Apologetics 101. We're here today to discuss another living fossils video. It's like, wait a minute, I thought you were going to move away from this subject matter. So did I. Didn't happen that way. Well, anyway, I wrote an article responding to one Christian Ryan. Um, and I said I would write. I wrote it from my website, and it's probably I think it's the longest article I've ever written on my website. I included images in this one, including of the actual molars of Castorocauda. Castorocauda is the name, the technical scientific, the name that they gave it for the fossil in which is for the beaver-like fossil, the one that has some similarities to a beaver. And so a lot of this debate centers around Castorocauda. I don't know why. There's so many more living fossils, even some there that have way more stronger evidence than even Castorocauda. But some reason everyone seems to be centering it around Castorocauda, the beaver-like mammal. And so that's becoming a kind of a center of controversy among even among some YCs, because there are some young Earth creationists that don't approve of living fossils, the idea of living fossils. One group specifically is named New Creation. Um, I'm not exactly fully sure of what New Creation believed. I talked to a guy that says he worked for New Creation named Paleo, and he told me that there's a diversity of views among members of New Creation. So I'm not exactly sure what positions everyone takes. I'm thinking a lot of them are probably going to take positions similar to that small group of YACs that believe in walking whales and feathered dinosaurs. And so that tend to be more sympathetic towards some of the interpretations that evolutionists make. And I think that a lot of people in New Creation is probably going to be around that. It's hard to really say for sure. And I don't know specifically what Peter believes on everything or what Christian Ryan believed on everything. But anyway, I responded to Christian Ryan, and a guy named Peter. He has given me permission to use his name. Um, uh, it's already public on my website anyhow since he responded, and it's actually under Peter. So that's how I know what his name is. But he has given me permission that it's okay to use his name publicly, and he's also said that he's also given me permission. Full disclaimer: he's given permission to do a full video review, response video of his entire video. So I'm gonna be doing a point by point response, and we're gonna discuss things that he brought up in the video and things like that. But anyway, he responded, and then I responded to him, and then I did note in my response that he did not bring up none of his response to my article had anything to do with Castorocauda. It just was him nitpicking this point or that point, and and it turned out he was wrong on those points too. But it didn't have any kind of overall impact on my article as a whole. And so I noted this in my response, and so he comes back and says his thoughts on Castorocauda, and he gives a link for a video he just made. And I go to the video, and sure enough, he gives his position on it. Now, of course, this is whenever I respond to people, it's never personal. I'm sure Peter and Christian are really swell guys. If you met them, you would like them. So I'm not suggesting anything negative about them personally. It's really just the arguments that we're dealing with, and responding to those. And there's a lot of misconceptions that are made on Castorocauda, sometimes on both sides, but usually on the evolutionist side because they're relying heavily on drawings from a particular paper. And that's something that, and one of the biggest things on my channel that I try to really emphasize is the fact that I really want people to be able to think critically, to be critical thinkers. And a lot of evolutionists, in my experience, are not critical thinkers. And I'm not saying all YCs are too. There are some YCs that might not be. But critical thinking skills, I think, is very important when you're analyzing arguments and evaluating, including evaluating your own argument. You need to be able to think for yourself. And so, if I can get evolutionists to pause, for example, in their uh, goal to try to debate creationists and in an endless back and forth, if I can get them to stop and think about what they're saying, then I've probably done a lot more than what most Christian apologists have done. Because if you just throw evidence back and forth and you get caught up in an evidence war where you just kind of throw evidence at each other, you may not be able to get very far with that. You're going to end up putting up a brick wall. And when one person puts up a challenge, you put up another brick wall, and the same thing goes for the other side. And it just and they'll just end up resisting more. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with talking about evidence. I think evidence is great. I think that we should talk about evidence. I'm very interested in a lot of these topic matters and subjects that come up, and I'm all for talking about the evidence. And we're going to be talking about evidence today as well. So I'm not opposed to talking about evidence, but at some point you have to get at the core of the issue. You have to get at the bottom line, because if you don't, all you're really doing is just throwing evidence at each other and seeing which one sticks. But if I can force the evolutionists to stop and think critically about what they're claiming, about who they're believing in. Someone says that something is millions of years old. Do they not stop and ask how they know that? They haven't even done lab testing and they're already assuming it's millions of years old. What assumptions go into that? How are they interpreting the data? What are they doing wrong here? You have to be able to think for yourself. And one of the things that I've noted in a lot of the people that are anti-living fossils is that they'll point to the drawings that someone made and assume the reliability of the drawings without actually looking at the fossils to see if it's true. But today we are going to do that. It's the third time of me doing that, actually, because I do feel like that I want to get these people to stop and think, okay, you're relying on drawings made by someone else. Drawings are more interpretive than the actual interpreting the fossil. It's even more interpretive, because in drawings you can use your imagination and be even more creative and redesign it the way you think it's supposed to have looked like at one time, and that sort of thing. And there's all sorts of misleading issues involved with drawings as well. And so we'll get into that later on. In the meantime, let's cue the theme intro, and then we're going to jump into the video.
Did modern mammal groups live alongside the dinosaurs? Recently, there's been a lot of discussion surrounding a particular fossil, nicknamed the Jurassic beaver. This small, mammal-like creature was found in rock layers alongside dinosaurs, and it appears to have some features in common with beavers. So are beavers living fossils? The fossil that we'll be discussing today is Castorocauda lutrosimilis.
All right, he does kind of start it off pretty good, but the statement that beavers are living fossils, the issue would be not over beavers as a group. It'd be more specifically over Castorocauda, whether Castorocauda is a living fossil or not. Beavers would technically be living fossils anyhow, since we actually do find fossilized beavers in the rock strata. It's just a question of whether it's found alongside dinosaur rock strata or not, and that sort of thing. But technically speaking, Castorocauda itself is what's in question, whether it's a living fossil. So he kind of said that in reverse. I'm not entirely certain why.
And it comes from northeastern China. Here's a photo of the fossil. You can see that the slab has been fragmented into multiple pieces. So on the right-hand side of the image, you can see there the head and one of the front legs of the animal. Then, as you go across to the middle, you can see there's the pelvis, some of the back legs, and then on the left side, its tapering tail. Now, this fossil is so beautifully preserved that we can see across it all these markings of the integument. So we can tell where it had fur, where it had scales. There are obvious.
All right, before he jumps into that, um, I actually mentioned that in my article response to Christian Ryan that it was broken half. And yeah, I agree with Peter's assessment there that you could see, like you could tell it had fur, scales. I mean, it's I think it was well preserved, but it is broken in half, and it is kind of partial picture. That photo that that Peter had shown is the only known live photo of Castorocauda. I think it was leaked out originally by the founder of the discovery, the one who discovered the fossil, and I think he leaked it out on Twitter, and that's how it got out, and it started getting passed along the internet. Um, but it's the only known fossil picture. Why is that? Because the original owners of the fossil do not let anyone actually look at it or examine it. That's why you only see drawings of it and computer generated simulations of the creature and that sort of thing. You only see those kinds of stuff because there's only one known fossil, or the only one known picture of the fossil out there that's floating around. And it's not a full picture. It is broken off on the sides, where you can't really see too much in the bottom half of the fossil. The fossil itself is broken in half. That is absolutely correct, and I mentioned that in my article response to Christian Ryan, which Peter has read. So that's all true enough. Um, and of course, Dr. Carl Werner told me that he was not allowed. This was one of the ones he was not allowed to see nor photograph, so he couldn't do a side-by-side comparison. And as far as I can tell, nobody is allowed to see it, which means the people who wrote the paper that everyone keeps referring to also was not allowed to actually see it. So basically, everybody is just kind of taking everybody else's word for it. I think there's some true stuff out there, but we also have to be careful and be cautious because it could be mixing with some false stuff as well. So let's continue.
Obviously some similarities between Castorocauda and the beaver. So let's check them out. This is a tanned beaver hide. This is its little snout right here. I love that it has its whiskers on it yet. And then it's got its tail right back here. Now, if you feel it, it's very soft, very luxurious. They used to make these into hats. And when you look at the fur, you can actually see that there are two different types of hairs. So there's this kind of soft, fluffy fur, and then there are these taller, longer hairs. So this soft stuff is called underfur, and then these taller hairs are called guard hairs. And that's what gives it such a nice, soft, fluffy feeling. Now, scientists were able to also see these structures on the fossil of Castorocauda. So they were able to see these shorter hairs and the taller, longer hairs, indicating that Castorocauda had a nice, soft pelt similar to the beaver, which would be ideal for swimming in the water. However, this feature is not unique to beavers. Beavers have webbed feet to help them paddle through the water.
That's true. It's not unique to beavers. No one has, as far as I know, nobody in this discussion has claimed it to be unique to beavers.
If I take the foot here and kind of splay it like this, you can see that in between the claws there is this nice webbing. That webbing increases the surface area of its foot, allowing it to, paddle more, just like when you put on flippers. Your foot is now functionally a lot larger, helps you kick against more water and swim faster. Now, of course, beavers are also famous for having a big, broad, scaly tail, and they swim by paddling with their tail as well. And you can see here, we've got all of these different layers of these scales. And so these scales are made of keratin, which is the same stuff as your hair is made out of, and your fingernails. And these feel kind of rough, almost like reptile scales. Castorocauda had a similar tail. Down at the base, there was a bit more fur on the tail, but once you got up higher, most of the tail was covered in scales. So there are three main features that Castorocauda shares in common with the beaver. Its fur, its webbed toes, and its scaly tail.
Technically, the fact that it's considered semi-aquatic is also similar to that of a beaver, because a beaver is also semi-aquatic. But someone can suggest it's semi-aquatic because of those particular features, which of course Peter will suggest that, and he has a particular hypothesis that I refer to as the niche hypothesis, but we'll discuss that toward the end of this video. And I also responded to Christian Ryan, who also argues something similar.
But none of these features are unique to beavers. Many different mammals have this underfur and these guard hairs. Many different aquatic mammals have webbed toes. I mean, yes, the beaver does, so do muskrats, so do otters, so do platypuses, right? Very different groups of animals all have this same feature because it's a useful feature for swimming in the water.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit on the webbed feet on with Castorocauda, beavers, and other animals as well. Now, he says, okay, well, first of all, let me point out the fact that I don't argue that that these features are unique to beavers only. As far as I know, I don't know of anyone that actually argues them as unique. The way I usually express it is I usually express it as distinct, where you can actually look at it and tell that it looks like a beaver's tail. You know, because beaver's tail is not a common feature. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on toward the end of the video. When we get to the niche hypothesis, I do want to discuss about whether or not, like the beaver's tail it's not a feature that's common only to beavers. It's not unique only to beavers, but it is not exactly very common among life forms. And same thing with web feet. And when they first discovered that mammals had, that there were some mammals that had web feet, like the duckbill platypus, for example, that was a surprise because we weren't expecting that. Mammals usually don't have web feet, but some mammals do have web feet. And there's actually entire lists you can find online of mammals that have webbed feet, including the duckbill platypus. That's probably the more well-known mammal that has webbed feet. Now, the interesting thing about both Castorocauda and beavers is not just the fact that it has webbed feet, and this is one that Peter doesn't really get into this video. It's one he's not taking that into account when he talks about the webbed feet. But the interesting thing about the webbed feet is that the hind feet of Castorocauda is webbed. Not just he don't Castorocauda does not have all four of his feet webbed, just his hind feet. Why is that interesting? Because webbed hind feet is much less common, especially among mammals, right? Because usually a lot of mammals have 4 feet, right? But for the hind feet only to be webbed, that's unusual. Usually they have all 4 feet webbed. And it's not all webbed feet is used for swimming, actually. Some breeds of dogs have webbed feet. That's unusual. I'm not entirely certain what they're for. They could be for swimming, but the kangaroo's webbed feet, now that surprised me because kangaroos are not considered aquatic animals. They're not aquatic. They're not semi-aquatic. So why in the world do they have webbed feet? They're good swimmers, but they swim like dogs, paddling with their front feet or their hands and that sort of thing. And of course, with kangaroos, they only have one pair of feet. But their web feet, I think, is used more like shock absorbers because they're jumping around everywhere, and so they use it kind of like shock absorbers. So to assume that just because they have web feet meant that they are aquatic or semi-aquatic technically is an interpretation. I don't find it too far fetched to think about in terms of interpretations go. Um, uh, to imagine that something with web feet might be in the water, they're much more likely to be the case than it be used for some other purpose, like in the case of kangaroo, where the web feet is more used for as a shock absorber. I'm not exactly sure why some breeds of dogs have web feet. That's unusual. I don't know why that is. Um, that's odd. Maybe they those are dogs that they go in the water a lot. I don't know. I have to look that up. But I know that I found that out that some breeds of dogs even have webbed feet. But the interesting thing is, there's only 3 mammals that I found online that have webbed front feet or webbed hind feet like that. That that I found that had webbed hind feet. Only 3. One was the beaver that we already mentioned. Another is a muskrat. Muskrat. Um, and the third is nutria, something like that. And I've never even heard the third one, but Peter's going to mention it as well. But all 3 of them, I think he already mentioned it just now. But all 3 of those are what they classified as rodents, and they're the only ones I could find that all have their hind feet webbed only. All the other ones I found, river otters, and a bunch of others, and that I found that had webbed feet, had all 4, unless they only had one pair of feet, like in the case of kangaroos. But if they have 4 feet, all 4 feet was webbed if they were webbed, or if they were webbed at all, except for those 3 mammals. They're the only ones, and all 3 of them are rodents. So I found that interesting. Now, I'm not saying that there wouldn't be more than that. I'm just saying that in my research, those were the only ones I could find with webbed hind feet. So the interesting part about this is not just the fact that it has webbed feet, but that its hind feet are webbed. And I actually mentioned this. I didn't do a lot of this research at the time I did the article, as far as what I'm telling you now. But I knew that but I did bring up the fact that Castorocauda has its hind feet webbed. The skin that was found between the digits of its hind feet. And so everyone agrees its hind feet was webbed. And I think that's strong evidence that its hind feet was webbed. So it's not just the fact that it has webbed feet, because if you just have webbed feet, it's easily to say, hey, look at the duck-billed platypus. It has webbed feet too. But it has all 4 feet webbed. Whereas the beaver is one of the 3 animals in the world that I found, the other 2 being also rodents, that have their hind feet webbed. It's not just the fact that it's got webbed feet, but it has hind feet that are webbed. That's interesting. And that is something that is very uncommon, even among mammals with webbed feet. It's extremely uncommon. And so I found that very interesting. But let's continue the video.
Even the scaly tail is not unique to beavers. Beavers are rodents, and they share some
That's true that it's not unique to beavers. I think their river otter has a similar tail, but river otter's tail is more, I don't know, more rounded, whereas beaver's tail is a little bit more wider. Beaver's tail is not unique to beavers, but it is very uncommon among animals. So it's much more distinct when you see a beaver's tail.
features of the skull and teeth with other rodents. So let's check out some rodent skulls. Beginning here with a porcupine. The first thing you'll notice here are these big front teeth that are kind of yellowy. Those are incisors. Now, we have incisors too, but we have 4 of them. 4 on the top, 4 on the bottom. Rodents have 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom. And another difference is that their incisors continually grow throughout their life. So as they kind of grind down the ends of the incisors by gnawing on all sorts of things, those teeth just grow back. The sockets just continuously grow. And you'll notice that behind these big front teeth, there's a gap before we get to the back teeth, the cheek teeth. What's going on there? Well, rodents are actually missing canine teeth. We have canine teeth. Those are those ones that are a little more pointy, right? Right here. They have a single sharp cusp. Rodents don't have canine teeth. Instead, they go directly from the front teeth to the cheek teeth.
All right. We're going to be looking at Castorocaudas at a little bit later, because I want him to flesh out all his arguments that before we get there. But what he's saying about rodents is true. They do possess that space. Now, and they don't have canine teeth normally. That's true. But it would not necessarily be true for Castorocauda, in the sense that yes, he has a tooth that they're claiming is a canine. Okay, let's assume that it is. All Castorocauda's teeth are sharp anyhow, but they actually do have a space between where the teeth ends and where the end of the snout is. So there is a space there. It's not quite curved like that, because the skull is a little bit straighter, and we'll get into all that later. But I just wanted to point out the fact that yes, Castorocauda most likely has canine teeth, but he also has that gap. We'll see in a second what I'm talking about there.
And when we look at their cheek teeth, they're very flat. Their premolar and their molars are all very flat, but they have all these little dents in them. They don't have clear projecting cusps like most mammals do, and that's because rodents are herbivores. They're grinding on plant matter. That flat surface helps them grind up their food.
And of course, animals with sharp teeth have been known to be herbivores. Um, for example, in the case of koala bears, they eat mostly koala leaves, but those leaves need to be ripped up into smaller portions. So they use their sharp teeth to do that, to eat plant matter. But they have very sharp teeth. They use their sharp claws to rip open walnuts and the like. And bears are omnivorous, but yet they have very sharp teeth. They can eat both plants and meat. And so that's just an interpretation. So yeah, but I would say that all modern day rodents today are herbivorous, including the beaver, and that sort of thing. And I agree with him on the architecture of beaver's teeth. They are flat. They're big, broad, and flat. We can see that from fossil skulls. Let me show you what I'm talking about. We're here. Let's look at a beaver skull, and you can see the teeth, how they're flat. And oh, by the way, he called it yellow, but it's actually orange. This orange tint right here in front, in the around the teeth and stuff, that's actually due to the amount of iron in their teeth. That's why it's got that orange color. Um, but yeah, you can see that it is flat, and uh, designed a certain way, and there is also a space here. Now, I don't know. I don't think it's just because they don't have a canine teeth. Even if you had canine teeth right here, it wouldn't matter. There'd be still space. The space is created because of the shape of the jaw and because of the incisors there at the end. It's not done just because they don't have canine teeth. Because they don't. Modern day beavers don't eat meat. They eat uh, like Peter said, they're herbivores. So they eat plant matter and that sort of thing. Um, but they have this space right here, right, where their teeth ends and where the snout begins, and you got this part. It's a little shorter than this one, and then you got the incisors. So you can see their incisors here, and they do have that space right there. That space is probably created for their incisors on the ends of their mouth. Um, but their teeth ends, and then they got this space right here between that and the end of their snout, and you got the incisors there. All right, let's continue our video.
Here I've got a nutria, which is a South American rodent. And you can see it also has these features. You can see there those big, ever-growing front teeth.
I mentioned the nutria a minute ago. It is a rodent, and considered a rodent, and it has hind webbed feet too. But yeah, that's what I was referring to a minute ago.
Once again, there's a gap right here in between the front teeth and the cheek teeth. And once again, these very flat molars. And beavers have these features too. That's what makes them rodents. You see, rodents are a group that are defined by certain features that they all share in common.
That's how we group them. The modern classification system, though, is man-made. I'm not going to get into that in this video. I've dealt with it a lot in my response article to Christian Ryan. I'm not going to get involved in this, but the man-made classification system is, well, man-made. But it does, I'm not saying it's arbitrary. Like Peter said, that they're doing it based on certain common characteristics, and that's fine, and there's nothing wrong with that, grouping it that way. My main problem is really the way they argue that and use that to apply it in a universal sense, like assuming that all rodents would look the same as they do in the modern context, throughout all time, and rodents could have looked very differently back in, way back when, or pre-flood, or whatever the case may be. And since then, they could have broken off a group and developed the characteristics that we commonly use now to group rodents. Um, but the assumption is that the rodents always look that way. Well, you don't really know. You don't really know unless you can take a time machine and check it out. But I'm not going to get too much into that discussion. It's enough right now to know that the modern classification system is less than 300. We could have grouped them very differently than what we did group them, but we decided to group them the way they did according to that particular characteristics, and as a result, all animals that have those particular characteristics are now classified as rodents and that sort of thing. So,
dentally, Castorocauda is quite distinct from the beaver and other rodents. Take a look at this diagram of Castorocauda's jaw. The first thing you'll notice here is just the general shape of the jaw. Note how long it is. The beaver jaw and the jaws of other rodents are shorter and they're more curved and flexed.
All right, that picture comes from a particular paper. We're going to go into it in a little bit. I want him to flesh out all his arguments here before I go to it, because when I go to it, I'm going to discuss everything from the shape of Castorocauda's jaw to the architecture of its teeth, to the gap between where the teeth ends and the end of its snout. I'm going to be discussing all of that. But the relevant point here is that he's relying on drawings. Notice, however, with the beaver and the spring hair, notice he's using an actual, those probably are cast too, but he's at least using that, right? It's a live action, it's a live photo of those particular animals. But with the Castorocauda above, it's a drawing. He simply is copying that particular drawing from that particular paper, and he's using that. And that drawing is highly interpretive. And it's also misleading because it makes you think that that's the entirety of the jaw, and there's actually missing teeth, or if assuming there was teeth there, those incisors in the front, for example, that's been drawn in there is not actually present in the mouth of Castorocauda. But we'll get into that in a minute. But he does not actually show the actual teeth of Castorocauda, he shows the drawing of that jaw.
Castorocauda had a very long, flattened jaw. And when we look at the front, what we see is that it did not have two very large incisors in it. Instead, it had multiple very small incisors.
Those teeth are actually not present on the actual Castorocauda skull. That's drawn in there by the writers of that paper. Now, there is a spot on there that looks like where some smaller teeth were. But what those teeth actually look like, assuming that that is what went there, we don't know because we don't have the teeth. So we don't know if they're incisors. If incisors are supposed to be like these sharp teeth that's supposed to be on front, that's supposed to help cut meat. But these teeth are actually missing from the actual skull. Now there's a spot that looks like that could have housed teeth there at one point, but we don't know because we don't have the teeth there. So, so it's an interpretation. But he's basing that on the drawing. Now the drawings don't actually use the word incisors and have the little line there pointing to those teeth as incisors. Rather, he drew that there probably through some sort of imaging technology, and put that there. But the actual drawing just has the skull, the jaw area, and drawn, and those particular teeth, and that sort of thing, and those four little teeth there
So
out
it's
front. But we'll get into that here in a little bit.
incisors in it. Instead, it had multiple very small incisors. So it's missing those diagnostic, ever-growing, enlarged front incisors.
Now, I do agree that it doesn't have that on there, but just as the teeth of Castorocauda could be missing, so are the incisors. We don't know whether it has incisors. The only way I can tell whether it has incisors if we had a front view of the skull and we could tell if it used to have incisors. There's no way to tell for sure, so I have to make an inference. I think it did have incisors at one time, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But uh, I do think that it probably did have the big incisors in front, but there's no way to know for sure because all we got is a side image of the photo, so it's impossible for us to tell if it actually has those incisors or not. Now, if we had the teeth like what he's pointing to, maybe we'll know it has some kind of incisors, but those teeth are actually missing. So we got to make another interpretation with those teeth because we don't know what they actually look like. So there's a lot of inferences that we have to make as a result. But he's relying on these drawings right now. And this is one of the things that I actually responded to Christian Ryan on because that's what he was doing. He was relying on the drawings. So is Peter. Peter is relying on the drawings for his information. And the drawings can be very misleading. Let's move on.
You'll also notice that there is no gap between those front teeth and the cheek teeth because Castorocauda had a canine, that larger projecting tooth right there.
All right. The canine tooth is present in Castorocauda's mouth. We'll get into that in a little bit. But, he's argued that there's no gap there. Technically speaking, there is an actual gap between the end of his teeth and the beginning of his snout. Now, what he's arguing is the cheek teeth, which is the teeth behind the canine teeth. And so there's a canine teeth there, and so there's no gap as a result. It's just those incisors that are there, and that sort of thing. But there's actually more to the snout than what appears in that drawing. And we're going to cover that here in a little bit.
Once again, that's something that you don't see in rodents. Behind the canine, there are lots of premolars and molars, more than rodents have. And if you look at their individual cusps, you'll see that they're not the...
Actually, molars, if you only counted the teeth in Castorocauda's mouth as molars, then he basically would not have any conventional cheek teeth, conventional regular teeth. The molars are actually the back teeth. That's what actually constitutes molars, is that they were the back flat teeth. In docudontid, docudontas, uh, docudonts, the species that is claimed to be extinct, existing in the Jurassic time, there's very little bit of the fossil evidence. Our fossil evidence is not very good. If put it this way, if Castorocauda was actually a dogodont, it would be the most preserved out of them because that they're usually mostly just skull fragments. But the most distinguishable feature of a dogodont is its molars, and Castorocauda's molars are very different from that. Castorocauda's molars, the actual back teeth, are actually flat. Um, these other teeth are not molars at all. That you might be able to classify them as cheek teeth. That's fine. But this idea of classifying them as premolars and molars. In fact, by the way, the drawing has far more of the molars than Castorocauda does, or far more teeth than Castorocauda does. Way more. This is not. This makes it look like his entire jaw is filled with teeth. If you actually see the fossil, there's a lot of gaps here. There's only so many teeth in the actual jaw that's been found, or the fossil with its jaw. So this right here is a very misleading image.
The flattened teeth of rodents, instead, these teeth have lots of very distinct cusps. Castorocauda's molar teeth are specialized for eating aquatic prey. When you look at the teeth, you can see that some of the cusps are leaning towards the back. And
Actually, it doesn't have that cusp or the back. The molars themselves are not flipped backwards like that. Um, but they don't have actual, not like that. It's more similar to that of rodents. Like he said, there was some similarity there, but he doesn't think it's to the extent. He's relying on the drawings for the image of the architecture of the teeth. I'm going to show the teeth here in a second.
this is a feature that is seen in some different aquatic mammals that allows them to catch on, hold on to slippery fish and eat them.
That's an interpretation. Uh, yeah, some might have that, but not all. And on top of that, what do you do about the ones that don't have that? And be eating fish, that sort of thing. I have no problem with it if it turns out to be Castorocauda ate fish, but there's just no way to know that. That's an interpretation. You have to interpret it that way. Even if it had those cusps, that does not necessarily mean it would use them to hold on to slippery prey. It could have, but maybe it didn't. We don't know. There's no way to know unless we take a time machine and go back and observe its eating habits. Unless we find one with, an animal preserved in its belly. Occasionally we find that, and then we will know whether it ate fish or not. But otherwise, we don't know. And of course, I think the cusps are more similar to that which we see on the teeth of a beaver. So it's not, because it's not as pronounced as what you see in the drawings. The drawings are highly interpretive, and so they're drawn according to the way they think that the animal originally looked, and that sort of thing. They're not as the actual teeth of Castorocauda is not quite as pronounced as this.
And so this is another difference between Castorocauda and the beaver. Beavers, remember, are vegetarian, so they have those flat molars for grinding up that plant matter.
You think, though, Peter, being a young Earth creationist, would automatically understood this, because this is a big deal among many young Earth creationists to point out the fact that that's an interpretation. You have to interpret the fossils that way. Just because I mean, what would Peter do about the idea of the animals being created with sharp teeth but yet the Bible makes it very clear that death did not exist before sin, and that the animals actually ate plants prior to, even though they were created with sharp teeth, prior to the fall. Uh, does uh, does Peter accept that? I would assume so. I've never met any YEC that would deny that. Um, the fall changed things, obviously, but would Peter acknowledge that? I wonder. But anyway, bottom line is that you have to interpret the evidence. There's no, there's nothing that would say that just because they have flat teeth means they have to eat meat. They could or have to eat plants. They could have, but there's omnivores with sharp and flat teeth that eat plants and meat, and have no problem grinding it up and that sort of thing. And that sort of thing. So it's I don't I, um, I would have to say that this is an interpretation that Peter is making. It is true that modern animals are like that. Would it be, and even with modern animals, there's still exceptions. But would he then argue that it is that universally in the past? And we don't know what to expect of a past organism, especially one that is extinct. We don't know what it ate unless it's preserved in the belly. You have to make certain interpretations when it comes to assuming the architecture of the teeth could tell you anything about what it ate. So these are kind of like very evolutionary centered ideas that don't take into account the fact that they're interpreting the data, but they are interpreting it. That's an interpretation. I don't really care if Castorocauda turns out to eat fish. I don't care if it turns out that he doesn't eat fish. It's not going to change anything for me, at least. Um, but uh, I do want to point out the fact that this is an interpretation.
Castorocauda does not appear to have been a vegetarian. It appears to have been eating aquatic prey. Unlike
Again, that's his interpretation.
beavers, Castorocauda did not fuse the right and left halves of its jaw. Scientists were able to see that these were distinct. They hadn't actually fused together in the front at the mandibular symphysis, where in humans and beavers, these two bones grow into each other and become one solid piece. Castorocauda didn't do that. It had a distinct right and a distinct left piece. Castorocauda's jawbone is quite similar to the jawbones of other mammal-like creatures found alongside the dinosaurs, specifically a group called docodonts. The docodonts were distinguished primarily by some features of their molar teeth. Remember those teeth in the back of your mouth. So their cusps, those points on their teeth, were taller on the outside of the molars than they were on the inside. So it's short inner cusps, tall outer cusps. And when you look at three cusps in particular, you'll see a kind of triangular shape between them. So these different features allow us to identify whether a creature is a docodont or not. And it turns out that Castorocauda has these features and thus is a docodont. So to summarize that all,
Incorrect. The molars in the back of the teeth. The back of the teeth is where the molars are. They're Castorocauda's molars were flat. Was flat and like that. Now there's always a possibility that the teeth could be broken off, but there's no way to know that for sure. The only way you could try to argue that is to try to argue the other teeth are molars, but then you're no longer relying on the fact that molars are the back teeth, not the teeth on the side of the jaw like that. And that's ultimately what you would end up having to try to argue. It's interesting that Peter admits that it is the back teeth, that's the molars. Okay, that's good because the drawings themselves, he's identifying other teeth as molars and premolars, and that's just not the case. Of course, he's relying on those drawings for his claim on that. And But in the back teeth, he admits that the molars are the back teeth. But he says, "Oh well, it's got these cusp, and it goes back, and they got this goes this way, and that's common with dockydonts. Yeah, but Castorocauda doesn't have that. Castorocauda's back molars, the actual back teeth of Castorocauda is actually flat. I can show it to you in a second. I'm also going to show it to you that I actually put this in my article response to Christian Ryan, which he did read, by the way. And so he should know this, that the back teeth does not look like that. All right. Um, we're going to let me make sure that he's finished with his argument on that, and then we're going to go directly to Castorocauda. There's a lot of details that I want to actually show you what the fossil actually looks like.
Castrocauda's jawbone looks nothing like that of the beaver. The entire general shape is different.
Okay, he does actually show that. That's interesting. He does actually show that. But if you see the molars here, they're flat. That's the actual molars. These right here are not molars. You notice that the teeth are much less than what we see in the actual picture. It's possible there could have been some teeth here. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So he does show a little bit of a close up, but he does that in order to argue about the shape of the jaw. We're going to get into that in a little bit. But these are the actual molars that's actually there on Castorocauda. These right here are sharp teeth. I think this is the one that they're calling canine teeth and a tooth. I think they might be right on that. But the teeth are nowhere near the amount that you see in the drawings. You notice that? That's because they are using their imagination a lot on that. But we're going to do a close up of our own and discuss that. But he does this close up, probably because I did it in my article, but he only does it on the shape in reference to the shape of the jaw. Um, but the molars themselves are actually flat. They're not bent backwards like that toward the mouth, the way he said they were. And even the teeth themselves, if you look at the teeth themselves, they're actually faced this way and not flipped backwards. And that's what they, even if you were to assume that these teeth are somehow molars.
The specific teeth that it has and how many of them are present are different.
No. I'm not exactly sure why he thinks that. The amount of teeth that's there is not that as many as what we saw in the drawing. Again, I think it's been done on purpose to make it look like the teeth are very different from that of a beaver's. I don't know, but uh, but this right here is how many teeth are actually present in the mouth of Castorocauda. These right here are the molars, and they, as you can see, they're flat. They're not faced away from the jaw or faced away from the mouth. They're actually pointing toward the mouth, actually, except for the canine, which is pointing straight up.
And instead, it has features that align it with other extinct groups of mammal-like creatures. Let's
No. And by the way, the mammal-like creature, I think he's trying his best not to use the term mammaliforms because that's ultimately what they tried to classify it as. And I do talk about mammaliforms, and basically it comes down to them arguing for the lack of evidence that it's a mammal. And so they, to be a mammal, it has to have certain features that are common with mammals, and that's why they would. And there are certain features that just don't fossilize. For example, one feature that is common with mammals is a neocortex that surrounds our brains, but brains cannot fossilize. Another one is mammary glands. That's what female mammals use to lactose their young, feed them milk and stuff. Uh, and but glands don't fossilize either. So, um, but I think it really comes down to evolutionary presuppositions involved there. I'm not so sure if docodontid is a real species that exists, um, because people think that docodontids incorporate all sorts of ecosystems and things like that. So it's really weird. Um, so I think it's anytime they have a mammal that they don't want to classify as a mammal, but it's found in the Jurassic layer, I think they automatically, prescribe it to that particular group. But I do not think that Castorocauda would even fit that particular group because the molars are different than what we see in Docodontid. So I don't think it's a Docodont, despite being classified that way.
Let's move on to the ear. Now, at first,
All right, before he gets into the year, I don't want to leave any stone unturned here. I do want to now move on to discuss to actually take you to Costacada and discuss the teeth and the skull shape and that sort of thing a little bit closer and discuss the actual architecture of all these structures here that Peter has brought up and discussed. All right, we're here right now. This is my picture of Costacada. And you see here, these are the molars. Notice the molars. First of all, the molars are kind of like on a hump, so they're not actually facing the jaw anyhow, but they're flat. That's what they are. They're flat. So now you got these teeth right here that are sharper, right? But look at where they're facing. They're not flipped backwards like that. That's Costacada's teeth right here. Um, and I don't see where there is any cust. There's some, but it looks similar to that of what we see on the flat teeth of a beaver. So they're not as profound or pronounced as what we see, what we're seeing in those drawings. The drawings are that they're getting is right here. This is where Peter and Christian Ryan are getting their drawings. This is the drawings of the things. You notice these front teeth right here. You see lots and lots of teeth right here. Peter identified these as premolars and all of these as molars. That's just not the case. The actual jaw of it looks like this. Nowhere near the amount of teeth. I assume that they assume that the smaller teeth went here. Um, I do not know because the teeth are not present. It looks like something might have been there, maybe broken off as a result of the flood before the creature fossilized. Um, but there's no teeth here. So I assume that the writers of the paper assumed that there were small teeth here at one point, and they drew them in the shape of sharp teeth. So the idea is that these are some form of incisors. I'm open to the idea that they could have had incisors there, but I think it's just speculation to assume the architecture of teeth we don't actually have. There's no way to know for sure without those teeth. And so I assume that everyone is just assuming that it's missing from this spot right here. This right here looks like the one that they're identified as a canine. I'm no expert on it, but I'm willing to go with their assessment that this is a canine teeth. It does look bigger than the other teeth and probably sharper. The other teeth, you notice it's pointing toward the mouth, except for this one. Um, but this one might even be pointing towards the mouth a little bit, but it's kind of on a little bit of a hill here. This one right here is pointing straight up. Like I said, it's on a little hill, but it's technically pointing straight up. These are pointing toward the mouth. Um, this one's pointing straight up. It's on the other side of the mouth here, apparently. And these right here are molars, and they're flat. Now they could have broken off, but there's no way to know what it looked like beforehand if that's the case. Um, And so you notice there's not nowhere near the amount of teeth as we're seeing in this drawing here. The teeth, look how many teeth are in this drawing. Does it look like it's that many teeth? No, nowhere near. And of course, what about the gap? He said there was no gap. That is incorrect. If you don't count the teeth here, there's no teeth here anyhow, so we don't know if there was teeth here. But if you count from here to here, that's how much of a gap we're talking about. Like up, like that. Now, if you say that these were smaller teeth, okay, then you still wind up with a gap, right, between that and the end of this snout. Notice the end of the snout is a little bit further than the smaller one. This is the way beavers look too. The bottom one though is a little bit more pronounced as far as inward like that from the top. But the top here protrudes out a little bit further than the bottom jaw. That's interesting. But there's no teeth at all. Typically, when you have animals with big snouts and lots of teeth, all right, when you have an animal with big snouts and lots of teeth, here's a dog's mouth. You notice the teeth here all the way out to the end of the jaw. That's what you would expect usually when you have that situation. In the case of Castorocauda, we have the teeth ending here, but no teeth, even a spot for any teeth for the rest of its snout, all the way to the end. That's unusual. Um, and I wonder, there's no way to know for sure because we don't have it. I don't know if it fell out, if it did have it, if it fell out or got knocked out or something during the flood. Possible. It's possible they could have had more teeth than it has right now. But uh, there's no incisors here in the front. Um, Now, there's no way to tell that unless you have a frontward image so you can see whether it used to have incisors, but it doesn't. I'm open to the idea that it could have had some bottom incisors, possibly, and maybe some incisors up in the front, but there's just no way to know because we lack those teeth. So there's no way to know for sure. But I do know that I do think it might have had incisors at one point because that's the only thing I could think of it having elongated snout, but there's no teeth here in this spot. So the claim that it doesn't have any kind of space here between the cheek teeth and the end of the snout is incorrect. It does actually have that. In fact, here's an interesting thing. He talks about how the shape of the jaw is straight, right? Okay, let's back out of this a little bit. All right, so we can see the full jaw. Now the head looks like when it got fossilized is kind of moved downward like that, so the jaw looks a little bit more slanted. But if we assume its head straight ahead, I would agree that this part of the jaw is straight, but it's not all straight. Because when you look at the thing, you notice that there's a slant that goes up like this. Let's enlarge it again. You see the slant right here. It goes up and it goes like this down. That little bent right there would be true even if you straighten his head out. It would still have that bent that went down from the teeth. That's unusual like that. Drawing made it look like okay, it's just absolutely straight. No, the entire jaw isn't completely straight. It's only straight here. But once you consider the entire snout as part of that jaw, it does have that bit that goes down as a result. He's fixing to talk about the ear, so we're going to get into that. But you can see here that there is a space. There's not as many teeth. The cusps are not as pronounced as what we see in the drawings. There's not as many teeth as well in the drawings. The incisors are missing completely if they have ever had incisors. And the molars here look different than what is being claimed. Now, the only way around this is to try to assume that all of these are molars of some kind. I'm not exactly sure how you could classify it. It's nowhere near the amount of teeth that we see in the drawing. Does he think that these are premolars and these right here are molars? I don't know. But either way, clearly it does not look like the drawing. He's relying on heavily on the drawing rather than on the fossil itself. And the funny thing is, he does actually show somewhat of a close up. He does that just because of the shape of the jaw, not because of the teeth. Because if you look at the teeth looks different from what the drawing actually showed. Let's move on and see what he says about the ears. I'm interested in responding to that as well.
Glance, it might look to you like there's nothing to really go on here. The back portion of the skull isn't preserved, so how can we have an ear? Well, if you look back at the jawbone again, you'll see on the back of the jawbone there's some kind of weird curved bones. Those are actually ear bones. We have those same bones, but those bones are not on our jaw. They're up, attached to the underside of our skull, and covered in a bony sheath. In fact, no living mammals have their ear bones attached to their jaw. But here,
We interrupt this normally scheduled program. uh, don't you hate that? Uh, well, anyway, while I was doing some editing on the video you're watching right now, I just happened to did some more exploring on this question of, what if it had ear bones attached to its jaw? Um, he says no living mammal today has that. Well, here's the thing. Let's assume that there is. I question whether how they could tell that it is, but let's say, that people trust their expertise and da da da. Maybe they could tell by the shape, even though the original writers of the paper, which by the way, uh, uh, Peter is actually relying heavily on that paper because the paper is the one who actually says that about the ear bones, and some reason he does not reference it or allude to it in any way or link it, or if he links it in the description box, I have to check to make sure. But I know that he doesn't actually mention the paper in his video, which is kind of odd since he relies heavily on what it claims. But the writers of the paper didn't have access to the fossil and couldn't examine it and that sort of thing either. So I just happened to question whether, you know, how would they know if it's an ear bone if they can't determine it's connected to anything. But it could be just part of the job. But let's just say that they could. Let's just say that they could figure out that it was an ear bone, and there are people like Peter that would trust their expertise on it, even though they didn't examine it personally. Um, but let's just say that for sake of argument, we assume that. How would Peter know that early mammals did not have this? I did some research online. Some trichodonts believed to have it. Docodonts might have had it. That sort of thing. And I think that Peter would acknowledge that. But here's the thing: uh, he assumes that those animals are not mammals. Well, how do we know they're not mammals? Um, I mean, there's no way to demonstrate it because certain things don't fossilize, like glands, for example. But how they know that mammals? You can't determine the mammal simply because it don't have attached. Because how do you know that modern mammals are properly representing mammals for all time? Because that's a made up category, right? We invented the way in which we group them. So you group mammals a certain way and say, oh, well, all mammals today don't have those bones. The argument winds up being circular, is what I'm getting at. He has to assume that things like docudonts, trichodonts, and things like that, what's usually classified as mammalian forms by evolutionists, which I think is a cladistic terminology. And I actually checked with Dr. Haynes on this. She said that normally she would not have classified it that way, except that they redefined the word clade, and they consider that a clade, and so because of the way they classify clade, it would come down to a terminological issue in terms of it being um, uh, a clogistic term. So they assume that these are not mammals, but they evolved into mammals and that sort of thing. And they've actually found uh, um, the inner ear bones allegedly attached in that way to the jawbone. So the question I would have for Peter is, how does he know that the early mammals did not have this attachment? What he basically would have to do is says, oh well, docodontid aren't early mammals. Oh, they have an attachment. Modern mammals do not. Therefore, this must not have been a modern mammal. The entire argument would wind up being circular. So even if there's any truth to it, even if you were to grant that thesis, I question it heavily how they would even know if that's even an ear bone. But let's just say that they could and they have expertise and even if they personally examined it, which the writers of the paper more than likely did not, nobody has access to the original fossil. But let's just say that they did. Let's just say that they did. Um, and determined it is ear bone, and people like Peter and Dr. Joe Duff and others would trust their judgment on it. All right, and let's just say that that's the case. Um, would that mean anything? No. At best, it would just be a circle argument. You have to assume that mammals at one time or another did not contain the ear bone, inner ear bones attached to their jaws. Modern mammals tend to have, I think they have it, heard some kind of cartilage connects it, and then that cartilage kind of turns into bone or something like that, and so it becomes one solid bone. But the point is that how they know that early mammals didn't have that. As far as I know, everyone, including evolutionists, believe that things like docodonts and trichodonts and things like that, which they think evolved into mammals, had the bones separated. Now they try to argue that this is coming from the ancestry with reptiles, mammals ancestry with reptiles and things like that. But that's just not the case. That's evolutionary presuppositions. But the point is though that mammals could have actually had a separate a jaw that was had the ear bones connected to it. Just because modern mammals don't have that does not mean mammals in the past did not have that. And so you'd have to conclude right off the bat that they're not mammals because they have that, because no living mammals have it, and thus argue your way into a circle. So even if there was any truth to it at all, I would question to begin with whether or not how they would know that's the case. But let's assume that they do for the sake of argument. Even if that was the case, they'd have to argue in a circle and assume that these, including Peter, and in order to argue against the idea that these, like docodonts and trichodonts aren't mammals, they have to say, oh well, that they had those, living mammals don't, therefore they're not mammals, therefore mammals don't have that ever in all history, even though technically mammal is a modern day terminology. It's we chose to group it that way. So yeah. So who's to say that what is should be classified as mammals long time ago to begin with, in terms of what their jaw would have looked like? We don't know. You have to make an assumption, and you have to argue in a circle that all mammals in the past and for all time did not have this, and that's what you would have to argue for. And I don't think that's a logical argument. I don't think that's a viable argument. I don't think you can make that stick without assuming your conclusion.
Here in Castorocauda, those ear bones are attached to the jaw. And we see this in all of these other mammal-like creatures that were alive at the time of the dinosaurs. And this is actually one of the reasons why most scientists do not consider Castorocauda to be a mammal, because it does not have its ear bones distinct from its jaw bones. The two are still connected. A major difference between Castorocauda and the beaver is found down here in the
All right, let's go to that. Okay, my understanding is that what makes an animal what makes an animal a mammal, one of the features is that its inner ear bones are connected. And this is something that Christian Ryan also said in his paper, in his article. So Peter is arguing, oh, well, this right here is connected to his ear. But you notice this is fragmented. This is actually the part where it's actually broken off. So we don't know if there's no way you can sit there and argue that it's connected to its skull and that this ear bone is connected to it when the part in which should be connected is actually missing. And if you go to the drawings, this is where he's getting it from, right here, where it shows the shape right here up here, and it's claiming that this right here is connected, or at least Peter's claiming it, is connected to this at top. But you don't know that. This right here is broken, actually. This right here doesn't even look like the ear bones managed to maintain bones. You have to assume something here, and then you have to assume it's connected right here in the very spot that's actually missing. We don't actually have that evidence. So how can you argue that? The argument is that it claims that the inner bones of the ear, because we have in mammals, all mammals are said to have three inner bones that are inner ear bones that are that make it a mammal, because all mammals have these inner bones. And the argument is that so does Castorocauda, but there's no way to tell that because it's just like one solid sheet. So how do you know that? So he tries to argue this part right here is connected to or the skull, like it's one bone right here, instead of being distinct. Our ear bones are are not connected in this way. And but how in the world does he know that Castorocauda is connected this way? He doesn't, because the part in which Castorocauda would be connected is actually missing. Because he says this is his ear bone, but the ears would actually be technically up here. So this would be like bones that's connecting toward the ear. But here's the thing. Where is that evidence that it was connected? Mammals have it connected like it's one bone, right? Because that's what mammals usually have, is like one bone. And he says this is connected not because there's actually evidence of. There's a difference between evidence that's missing versus evidence that's actually distinguishes this from this. You don't know that because there's a huge chunk here that's missing. So I don't think that this is the claim that this could actually be one bone. Usually mammals have this as one solid bone, and so the object of it is that, well, maybe this is a distinct from, at least the one that Peter's making, distinct from over here the ear bone. But it's, how would you know that? You can't know that. There's a missing piece right here. There's no way to know that because there's a chunk of it missing right here, and there's no way to know what's in the inner ear because it's just like a flat tablet. So there's no sign of even ears. You can't even see where the ears is. So I don't know how you could even determine that that's an ear bone or connected to the ear bones or what. So it's not that it's connected. You don't know if it's connected or not connected because there's missing evidence right here. We don't know that. And so you have to make an interpretation as a result and just assume it. But this is actually where it's actually broken off. So that's kind of important to have that evidence to argue that one way or the other. So no, no, I don't think that's correct to argue that here because we can't know. There's missing evidence here, and so they're classifying it as a mammalian form, which is technically not considered a quote unquote mammal, according to the modern evolutionary view and that sort of thing. But I would personally consider this a mammal because all the things that we can demonstrate that it had available to it, we can prove that it had. Like for example, fur. Mammals have fur, and even Peter agreed that it does have fur, similar to that of a mammal. Um, so it does seem like it is a mammal because it has all the other evidence of a mammal um, that we can demonstrate as a mammal. Um, but I don't know how you could be able to prove one way or the other whether it has inner ear bones or not. Also, like I said, what I was going to say about the molars, there's something else I want to say about the molars. Here I've got a here's from my paper, picture of my paper, and you can see the molars right here, or from my article, see it right here, and I got it circled and everything, arrow pointing to it. That's what the molars are. Okay, these right here are not molars, so I'm not exactly sure why he called them molars. And obviously they're nowhere near to look like what's in the drawings anyhow. Um, but these are very distinct from docodontid, which look like this. In fact, not only the molars look distinct, but even the teeth themselves look very different. Look at how the teeth are pointing toward the mouth. You see them pointing in reverse toward the mouth, like this. Okay, this is the front. This is the front. Okay, it's pointing toward the mouth, and you see them all weird looking, right? Um, and those are the molars right here, and you see they're very weird looking. But when you take a look at Castorocauda, the teeth are pointing more toward the snout here, not in the back. The molars are flat, and so I don't really know why they the artist whoever drew those drawings drew them, and essentially Peter is relying on that a lot for his information. As we can see, there is a gap between this tooth and here. Um, you have to assume teeth was in here. I don't know if there was. Could be. Don't know. It's missing. There's no way to tell. So you have to make an interpretation there. All right, let's continue. He's about to go into I think maybe it's his ribs he's about to go into.
A major difference between Castorocauda and the beaver is found down here in the abdominal region. Now, if you feel the sides of your torso, you can feel that there are hard bones, right? Your ribs. But as you get further down the side, you'll feel them kind of taper off inwards and your ribs stop. And there's just kind of a soft, fleshy area before you get all the way down to your hips. So placental mammals do not have any ribs on their lumbar vertebrae. Those are the vertebrae that are right above your pelvis. No placental mammals have ribs on their lumbar vertebrae. So beavers don't, muskrats don't, no rodents do, humans don't. Cats, dogs, horses, deer, none of them have ribs on those lumbar vertebrae. Some things do. Some living mammals, for example, the platypus has some ribs on its lumbar vertebrae. And do you know the condition in Castorocauda? That's right, Castorocauda not only had a different number of lumbar and sacral vertebrae from beavers, it actually had ribs on some of its lumbar vertebrae. So once again, here is another feature present in Castorocauda that is absent in all living placental mammals. A big, big distinction here.
All right, let's talk about that a second. Hello again, and given the I gave the the idea of the lumbar vertebrae overlapping with the ribs some considerable amount of thought and research, and I've come to the conclusion that that's incorrect. And so I'm going to show you why that's incorrect. Uh, but first of all, let's identify what exactly is the lumbar vertebrae. Okay, let me go to my picture here. All right. You see these little things right here? These are called vertebrae. All right. This right here is the sanctum. That's what's called the sanctum. It's around the hip area. Okay, you can see it connected to the back leg like that. All right. Um, and you can see the plates where the ribs are shielded with those plates. Like I said before, I agree with Peter on that it does have plates over the ribs and that sort of thing. All right. So um, the rib cage actually stops about right where this crack is. Okay, that's where the rib cage basically stops. That's why you don't really see any more plates after that because it's basically covering this area. So this crack would be our marker right here. Okay, what exactly is the lumbar vertebrae? The lumbar vertebrae starts around the tail line, right above the tail line, right above the tail line, and continues on until right before reaching the rib cage on most mammals, except for like the marsupials like duckbill platypus, which has it overlapping. Okay, like what Peter said. All right, this right here is the sanctum. Now the sanctum might be positioned in different places depending on the kind of animal we're talking about. For Castorocauda, it's positioned here. Okay, I think me and Peter would agree with that. That's where it's positioned. The vertebrae, of course, is going to overlap. Is going to overlap like this. So the vertebrae is going to go over top because the vertebrae is the digits that make up your that make up the little bony units that make up your backbone, what we call a backbone. All right, and well, in vertebrates, obviously. Now there are organisms called invertebrates that don't have a backbone, but invertebrate like fish, for example, invertebrate organisms like us, like mammals and the like, they will have a backbone, and that backbone will be made out of what's called vertebrae. So these are the vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae starts at the top of the tail line. So the tail line, we can, because how well preserved this fossil is, we can actually see where the tail line is. So it starts right above that, and it continues for about 5 to 6 vertebrae. It's actually, according to the internet, it's supposed to be like 5 vertebrae, but that might vary. So, but we'll say up to 6 vertebrae. Okay. So it starts here and moves on up, and of course it overlaps with the sanctum because it's actually above the sanctum since it's the backbone, right? And it goes all the way up. And for most mammals, like Peter said, it ends right below the waist level. Now, for Costacata, I think the lumbar vertebrae actually ends here, below the actual waist. Now, course, since there are some mammals that do have it overlapping, it would be an issue if it did. I don't know why Peter makes it into an issue unless he's just on the kick. Well, it can't be a beaver because a beaver is not like that. That's probably where he's getting at because he does admit that some mammals like duckbill platypus has it overlapping. But in this case, I think the lumbar vertebrae is actually below the waist level. Let me show you. Let me go to the drawings. Maybe it'd be easier to illustrate. Okay, here's the weird thing. Okay, right here, this thing right here is anatomically and positionally incorrect. What I mean by positional correctness, I mean in relationship to other body parts. It looks weird looking. Um, and I'll explain the anatomical incorrectness in a minute. But I think the purpose of this drawing was to identify the different areas. You see this area? Okay, so that's L5, L3, there's L1. It mentions in the paper too that the lumbar vertebrae, the lumbar ribs, is 1, 2, 6. It says. Uh, so This is L1, this is L3, this is L5. Not sure what L2 and L4 is. Um, but this right here is what they're identifying as the lumbar vertebrae. But if you look at the drawing, the lumbar vertebrae looks like it's above the sanctum. It doesn't start at the tail line. It starts right here. Now, if you go by this drawing, most of the lumbar vertebrae would actually be in the rib cage area, which actually contradicts what the paper actually says anyhow. But it looks weird. Now, this drawing, I think this drawing is actually accurate looking. You see the sanctum here. This is the actual lumbar vertebrae. Let me show you some pictures so you can understand what I'm referring to. Okay, this lumbar vertebrae right here. Now, the sanctum might be positioned in different areas. This is a cow, so the sanctum looks like this. So it's a little weird, but the tail goes like this, and so for the lumbar vertebrae starts here. Okay, and then you got a dog, and then again you got the lumbar vertebrae. Again, the sanctum is a little weird. So sometimes it might start above the sanctum, sometimes below it. It just depends on where the tail line is. And you see the tail right here. In every single one, the lumbar vertebrae always starts right above the tail line and continues like that. And you see it going right before reaching the rib cage. Um, see. Here's a duckbill platypus. And again, you see the sanctum. But in this case, the sanctum is like right here on the tail line. The vertebrae appears to go and overlaps with the rib cage. So it's a little bit different from what most mammals look like. Now, on Castorocauda, okay, the sanctum is right here. I think me and Peter would agree on that. All right, so the tail line, because of how well preserved it is, we can see where the tail line is, right? So, whoop, right here. Okay, the top of this is here. So technically the lumbar vertebrae would be right here, starting from here on up before reaching the rib cage. And so you count like five vertebrae up, right? So it'd be, or five to six. One, two, three, four, five, six. So it would actually be right here at the top of the where the sanctum is, on the fossil that is. And it would be below the rib cage. See this? Like that. That's the around the rib, around the where the rib cage is. So it's actually below it. This image right here is actually accurate. The lumbar vertebrae would start here, move right here, and it's below. You can see where the sanctum is in connection with it positionally. It's below the rib cage. It is not above the rib cage. So, in conclusion on that, I do not think. I think that when they did the numbers on the thing, they were not trying to do it positionally accurate. By positionally accurate, I mean in relationship to other areas anatomically. It was intended to just try to make room to put all those things on there, but anatomically, it's incorrect because it looks like they're starting the lumbar vertebrae above the sanctum, which is you would well one thing you would include the vertebrae that overlaps with the sanctum anyhow, um, but it would also depend on where the sanctum is. But in this case, it's but it always starts above the tail line and continues on to right below the rib cage, and it's like five or to six vertebrae. Okay, and if you count the five to six vertebrae, it would put it below it. It would not overlap with the rib cage. So I would disagree with that conclusion. If someone makes that conclusion, I'm not 100% sure the paper actually makes it. I've been looking at different references. It might say something like the one third overlaps with the ribs or something like that. I remember that. That's the closest I could find that seems to suggest it. But they were kind of really talking about or emphasizing the plated ribs. You know, the fact that the ribs are plated. Um, so I'm not exactly sure how much of the paper actually admits to that or claims that or whatnot, because one of the drawings is positionally correct. It is anatomically and positionally correct, whereas the other drawing is probably designed to identify different areas anatomically. And in doing so, though, if you were to compare it relationally to other parts of the anatomy there, it would look off. It's like a topological mapping of the anatomy. It's not intended to be um, uh, correct in terms of scale, and relationships. It's intended to be correct in the sense of identifying specific, parts of the anatomy and that sort of thing, and then having the room to put all the different labels on it and that sort of thing. But one of the pictures was positionally accurate. But I don't. So doing some more study on this, I do not think that the lumbar. I would not have a problem. By the way, I personally would not have a problem if it turns out that the lumbar vertebrae overlapped with the rib cage. It wouldn't matter to me one way or the other because, as Peter himself admit, some mammals do actually have that. In the case of the duckbill platypus, for example. So I would not really have a problem if it turned out that it did overlap, but I don't think it does. I think that is being either misinterpreted in the paper or the writers themselves of the paper had misinterpreted that, which is kind of ironic because in one drawing they were positionally accurate, while in another drawing they were not positionally accurate. So I'm not sure. Of course, the other drawing, the one with all the labels and stuff, was also upside down. So that's kind of weird. So the sanctum looks a little odd. So I don't know why they drew that upside down like that, but that could be one of the issues. But in any given case, I think that it did start below the sanctum. It does look like it does that in the fossil as well. So my position on that right now is that would be incorrect. I would not have a problem if it turned out to be correct. I just don't think it is. I want to add one more point here. Um, the Peter mentioned that the count of the lumbar vertebrae is more than it typically is normal, and I'm afraid someone's going to try to come like a supporter of Peter or supporter of Joel Duff or something like that is going to respond. Well, you did say it was more. Okay. For start with, that's preposterous. As far as anyone knows, that the lumbar vertebrae is always like 5 or 6 vertebrae. All right, but I think they're getting that from the picture because there was one inaccuracy in the picture, and I'm gonna show it to here. The one that I said that was positionally and anatomically accurate, it is, except on the count of the lumbar vertebrae. It actually makes the lumbar vertebrae longer than it actually is in the fossil. I'll show you in a second what I mean. All right, we're here with the fossil, and okay, if you notice the shape of the vertebrae, okay, the one where the tail is takes on kind of like an hourglass shape. And if you look up here, the vertebrae that's in the rib cage also takes on a different shape. The lumbar vertebrae literally looks, it starts right here at the top of the tail line, looks like a butterfly shape, obviously longer, expanded out from the hourglass shape, and continues up here. And then we see there's a crack here where I'm sure there's a vertebrae here, but we can't see what it is. All right, and then here we see the different shape that's inside the rib cage. Okay, now let's go to the drawing. You see the drawing here? Okay, it makes it look like the vertebrae is actually more than 6. Now, of course, even if that was the case, the drawing clearly shows that the lumbar vertebrae is the below the where the rib cage is, so it wouldn't matter either way. Because once you get up here, you can start seeing that the um, vertebrae is changing shape. Now, it might be that they're trying to make it look like it overlaps. So they have it like this, and it looks like it's overlapping, and it's actually not. Um, and if you start here, there should be like technically it's supposed to end around about 6, but this got like 8 vertebrae, I think. Like one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine. About 9, and all below the thing. And then you got even more if you include some kind of overlap right here, in which case it will wind up being 11, 12, 13, something like that. And that is way too much for the lumbar vertebrae. Now, if we go to the actual fossil, okay, again, we see it's changing shape here. And so the type of vertebrae that's here in the rib cage and the type of vertebrae that's right here in the tail are actually different from the lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae start, like I said, where the tail line is, it starts to expand out right here. So you might want to consider it right here, but I would probably say it's more like here, where the shape is a little bit more extended, okay, more butterfly like. But if you want to start here, that's fine. It would still, be the same, about 5 or 6 vertebrae. And you go here, overlaps the sanctum, like we said. Now, once you get here, there's a crack in the fossil. We can't see what the shape of the vertebrae is here. So that's kind of odd. Now we can see this at the top. It looks like this vertebrae because if this is a part of the vertebrae, then this looks like it's the same shape as this. So it would have ended right by here. We say, I would say, but we can't see what the vertebrae looks like here. Um, but if you go by the count that is being made in the drawing, you'd have the vertebrae all the way up here, and you could see the shape is different from the actual lumbar vertebrae shape. It's completely different. So you can actually tell what is the lumbar vertebrae just from the shape of the vertebrae because it differs from this and it differs from this, and it does not overlap with the rib cage. Now, in the actual fossil, that's the case. Now, there's a crack here, makes it harder to see the shape of whatever vertebrae is between these two, but this right here makes it look like it's the same shape as the rest of this. Okay. Um, so more than likely, the vertebrae probably the lumbar vertebrae probably stopped right here. Okay. And it's about 5 or 6, not 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. That's just crazy. But that's might be what Peter's going by is the count in that particular drawing makes it look like it's 2 to 3 times longer than normal lumbar vertebrae. But that's just ridiculous. But no, that's just not that would not be anatomically correct.
The actual structure of Castrocauda's ribs are quite distinct as well. So on its thoracic ribs, so kind of in this area, in its thorax, it had plated ribs, which means that the ribs had a expanded, kind of flat back to them, which means that on the back of the organism, they kind of almost overlapped each other with these broad plated ribs. And this is something that we see in some living organisms, not rodents, that allows them to dig once again. So by basically almost joining the ribs together, you are making the trunk of the organism more stable. So this is kind of creating a stable trunk which allows the organism to powerfully move its arms while digging. Castrocauda's tail vertebrae do share some similarities. Move its arms while digging.
Now I do agree that these have plates that have plated ribs. Of course, it's an interpretation to assume that it's just done because you know so they can be able to dig further. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Don't know. Um, you have to interpret fossils. So, but I do agree that there are that it does have plated ribs there. Um, it's hard to make it out, other than maybe right here, right here. Um, but it's difficult to see. The bottom half you can't really. There's not a whole lot to show there, so it's going to be much more likely to be clearer up here, where there's more of the rib cage that we can actually view. But the argument again is no rodents today possess that. No other animal today possesses that except for certain ones that dig. Therefore, it must not be a beaver because beavers don't have that feature. So essentially, he's arguing in reverse of the argument that some people make that it is a beaver. Look at these similarities. He's arguing, oh, look at these differences. Therefore, it's not a beaver. He's arguing the opposite direction. But the reality is, it doesn't logically necessitate it being a beaver or not being a beaver. We don't know what the animals at that time looked like. There could have been examples of animals at that time with plated ribs that were rodents, or that we would classify as rodents because of other reasons, such as the space here between the teeth and the snout. So that doesn't really exclude them as a rodent. It doesn't really even exclude it as a beaver. We don't know what they look like. It could be some sort of offshoot of a beaver or whatnot. But either way, differences don't logically necessitate not being a beaver or a rodent or whatnot. Just like similarities don't necessarily logically necessitate it as being a beaver or rodent. So we don't know what they look like at the time. So this is highly interpretive. Um, I'm so glad I don't actually take a dogmatic position on this because essentially, in order to take a dogmatic position, you have to either argue from the similarities or you have to argue from the differences. Those who take a dogmatic position in the opposite direction argue from the differences, where those who take a dogmatic position in the other direction, that it's a beaver or a rodent, will try to argue from the similarities. And so I think each one of those are going to be fallacious in their own way. And I don't think you can argue one way or the other because we don't have enough information. We only have the fossils, and it makes it much more harder to figure out. And we have to apply our own interpretation to the fossil, our own uh, assumptions, and interpret the fossils accordingly. We have to draw inferences from very limited evidence.
Castrocauda's tail vertebrae do share some similarities with those of beavers. When you look at the individual vertebrae, they look hourglass shaped or almost like a butterfly. You have a bulge at the top, a narrowing, and then a bulge at the bottom. So these processes on these vertebrae are designed such that they create a broad side-to-side structure. And this is basically what allows the organism to have this wide tail to paddle with, right? So beavers can't just have a completely fleshy tail. They actually need to have something in there for muscle attachments to give the tail structure so they can push down on it and paddle with it. And so they have very long processes sticking out to the sides of their tail vertebrae to kind of create this paddle-like structure. Now, in Castrocauda, it's not taken to the extreme that we see in beavers. When you look at the beaver tail, which you can see here on the bottom, you can see that these processes are much longer in comparison to the size of the vertebrae. But Castrocauda does have, to a limited extent, this feature, and this indicates that its tail, although not as specialized as that of the beavers, was apparently adapted for paddling in the water.
All right. Here's Castrocauda again. If you look at the vertebrae, like as mentioned before, you can see the changing of the shapes, right? The lumbar vertebrae differs from the vertebrae here. Peter shows the drawings of the Castrocauda, uh, but they're the vertebrae up here. I don't know why he shows that, but yet mentions the hourglass one. The hourglass vertebrae is right here. Okay, as we see, it starts out on the tail end, extended, just like the lumbar vertebrae, right? Just kind of extended out, butterfly shape. And then as we go into the tail, it becomes like hourglass shape. I mentioned this previously. Hourglass shape, and then goes all the way down. It gets the hourglass shape actually gets smaller and smaller to almost look like a bone shape. right? And until it goes on the tip. Now we can't see what the tip actually looks like. It's broken off here. Assuming that the next piece of the puzzle here is intended to be part of the fossil, then maybe the tip continues in the part of the picture we don't have access to. But I think it's a pretty good logical inference given how this is shrinking as it gets closer to the tip, that the tip is probably not too far off here and is probably even smaller. All right. So, if that be the case, then more than likely what we're having is that Castorocauda's tail would have started out broad, very similar to a beaver's, but it will shrink closer and closer you get to the tip, so it becomes more rounded like. So it will start out broad, flatten, possibly flatten right here, and then as it goes in, it will narrow out to it has a more kind of a tubular shape to it, a kind of a rounded shape toward the tip. So it'd be very like a beaver's here and very unlike a beaver's here, because a beaver starts out the base to the end as flat tail. This right here will start out broad, similar to a beaver's, probably not quite as wide, um, and then it will kind of shape itself into a more narrower shape. You know what I'm saying? And so that's essentially what it is. It would be similar to a beaver's tail, but obviously not a beaver's tail, if that makes any sense. And so that would qualify. So it would be beaver-like, at least in terms of right here, and then as it goes, then it would be clearly not a beaver's tail from that point. But I would say it would be broad here. It would be. It probably wouldn't be as flat as a beaver's tail, but similar to one. So I do agree with other evolutionists that have argued that. Of course, I'm not an evolutionist, but I would agree with evolutionists when they try to argue that this is similar to a beaver's tail. Although obviously there are evolutionists that are involved in this debate, such as Dr. Joe Dove and Peter as well, and Christian Ryan, who have tried to argue that this is not beaver-like, but that's just incorrect. It is beaver-like. It to an extent. Obviously, it will get to a point where it's not beaver-like, but it is beaver-like, like right here, like at least in part of the tail. You could tell it's very similar to a beaver's. The way it narrows out, probably not here. But it will be broad and flat up here, just not quite to the extent that beavers have. So I would say it's beaver-like, meaning that it's similar to a beaver, at least here. Now, as you get closer to the tip, it's going to probably likely narrow out and round up a little bit. And that's just makes sense of the fossil. Um, but so it would still be similar to a beaver's. It just would not be identical to a beaver's. Which, as far as I know, nobody claims it's identical to a beaver. But we are saying it's similar to a beaver, and it is, because it is similar to a beaver here. Now, as it narrows out, obviously it's going to be less and less beaver-like when you get closer and closer to the tip. But it is beaver-like here. Okay. So he makes kind of a big deal of that. I don't know. I'm assuming he's going to take the same position that Christian Ryan takes, where he denies it being beaver-like entirely. But that doesn't make much sense since we actually can tell that it is kind of broadened out here. It's just when it gets closer to the tip, obviously it's going to narrow out, becoming more tubular and less beaver-like. But it is beaver-like up here. And overall, it will look similar to a beaver, just not as flat, and it will narrow out to probably a point of some kind, and maybe a dull point. Um, but it clearly is similar to a beaver's in uh, several respects. Now, he's relying heavily on the drawings here, but I do agree that the drawings are accurate at this point on the tail. Although I would question whether they were accurate on the size or not, without being able to measure it ourselves, because they didn't actually see the see the fossil. So I don't know if they really could say specifically, but I would say that this probably would be a close approximation. So maybe Peter's right. Maybe it's not as pronounced as that of a beaver's. So what? Would that mean it's not a beaver? No. Would that mean it's not a rodent? No. Would that mean it's not related to a beaver? No. All that would mean is that this is a variation where the vertebrae are not quite as long, as not quite as extended out as a beaver's. That's all that would mean. It basically means a beaver's tail would wind up wider than Castorocauda's. Castorocaudas still have similarities to a beaver tail. It would still be beaver-like. No matter how you slice the cake, it would still be beaver-like. It would still be similar to a beaver. It would just have that one difference that the beaver's tail is a little bit wider and more fleshed out as a beaver's tail, or what we would normally consider a beaver's tail today. At best, this would be a variation, but it's not anything major. He makes it sound like a major, and some other proponents of this anti-living fossil view seem to see this as a major issue. It's really not. It would still be similar to a beaver's. It would still be beaver-like in this perspective that it is similar to a beaver's, as he himself admitted to. It'd just be a question of whether or not if it's as extensive as a modern day beaver. And I would say probably not quite as much as a modern day beaver. But we don't know how extensive it would be for a beaver that lived during pre flood times. Don't know. But I wouldn't say that that's some sort of major excluding evidence or something, the way people on that side, including Peter, has talked about this as if that's a major issue. That's really not. It's really not as bad as they're making it out to be. All right, let's continue.
Now I could keep going. We could talk about some more detailed features of the tail vertebrae. We could talk about the fusion of the pelvic bones, and that would all be interesting. But I'm hoping that by this point you've gotten the message of the video. That message being that although Castorocauda shared some features in common with beavers, those features were not unique to beavers, but were also seen in other aquatic mammals.
Technically, Castorocauda and beavers are considered semi-aquatic. They're not completely aquatic. Um, but yeah, you see similar features, uh, and you also see similar features in animals that are not aquatic. Kangaroos are not aquatic, but they have webbed feet. They're not even semi-aquatic. So yeah, but yeah, you do see similar features. They're not unique. I don't think I've ever argued for their uniqueness because unique would be a universal type word, and I usually try to avoid universal language if I can, um, because I'm afraid someone's going to pull some sort of long Latin name of an animal out of the woodwork somewhere I've never even heard of before, and as I see there's an animal with that feature, and so I try not to use that term. I wouldn't say that it's unique. I would say it's distinct. It's distinct because the feature is so um, recognizable as a beaver's tail. The similarities are striking to the point where if someone sees another animal that has a similar tail-like design, they would still argue it as a beaver's tail. They would say, "Oh wow, there's another animal that also has a tail of a beaver." That's how they would argue it, because the tail of a beaver is uncommon among animals. And because it's uncommon, it's very distinguishable. It's not absolutely unique, no, but it's distinct to beavers. It's very distinguished. They're very uncommon for other animals. the webbed hind feet. I can only find three animals, all three being rodents, that have webbed hind feet. And I make a big deal about the webbed hind feet in my article. In this video, it appears that Peter addresses the big deal of them having webbed feet, but he does not address the big deal of them having webbed hind feet. I don't know if Peter realized this, but that's even more uncommon than just simply having webbed feet. That's far more uncommon. Like I said, I could only find three animals, all rodents, by the way, that had webbed feet, webbed hind feet, and so I think that's interesting. The fact that Castorocauda had webbed hind feet, and then combine it with the other features of similarity, it's striking.
And secondly, that Castorocauda had features that are not seen in any living mammals, making it very distinct from them and much more similar to these other mammal-like creatures that were found alongside the dinosaurs.
Now, I would kind of disagree with that. I think what he means by certain features that are not distinct. Now, of course, that's true. There's some that has certain features that are distinct from all living mammals that exist today, but they don't know what mammals exist in the past. All the mammals that exist in the past, and so it could actually have that distinguished. And he says, well, it also has features that are similar only to animals that exist, or certain mammal-like creatures exist alongside dinosaurs in the Jurassic era, or Jurassic strata. That's false. Uh, uh, for start with, there's the docodonts is we got very little fossil evidence for the docodonts. Okay, the docodont. If you could classify Castorocauda as a docodont, it would be the most preserved out of them, because most of what we have is fossil fragments. So, with that in mind, how they know that docodonts have those plated rib cages, for example? They don't. The most distinguishable feature of a docodont is the molars, and Castorocauda's molars are different from a docodont's. Even its teeth don't even look like a docodont's. The docodontids have very complex teeth, and they're flipped backwards. They're, or at least on the, I know he says that they're flipped backwards on all the teeth, but I know the molars are supposed to be flipped backwards. It looks weird. It's actually pointed toward the throat, but these seem to be pointed either straight up or toward the mouth, toward the snout, and that's different, very different. And they don't look nothing like what you see in docodontids. So I would disagree with that. Um, Now they could have some features different from mammals that exist today. That's fine. We don't know everything that existed at all time with mammals, so it's possible that there could be mammals that don't exist today that used to exist that have these features in it. That's fine. I'm all for that. But I think he's trying to argue because mammals that we know exist today didn't have this. This must therefore not be a mammal. But that would require you to know what mammals had, all mammals that exist at that time had or didn't have. Since we don't have a complete fossil record, there will never be a time where we have a complete fossil record. Therefore, there's no way you can actually know what all mammals had for all time. It's just not possible. You only know what all mammals have today. They are alive today. That's all you can really go by. All right, let's continue.
I hear the objections rolling in. But what about the features that it does have in common with Castorocauda? Don't those prove that there is some link? I mean, it has those webbed feet, it has those wide processes on its tail vertebrae, and it has a scaly tail. So isn't that too much of a coincidence for it to share these features in common with the beaver? I don't think so.
He's about to get into his niche hypothesis, which we will deal with right here in a few minutes. But in terms of that, it does have similarities to that of a beaver. It doesn't necessarily mean it is a beaver. And Dr. Carl Werner is not arguing that it is a beaver when he argues this, um, but rather it does have similarities to a beaver. And it does, as he himself admits to. Now, he's going to get to the point where he's going to try to explain why it has similarities to a beaver, but yeah, he doesn't think it is a beaver. Okay, so that's going to come into his what I call his niche hypothesis. Um, we'll check that out here in a second.
Here's why. Because those features are ecological specializations. So let's think about this, right? So those web feet, that's a feature that is used to paddle in the water. There's a clear purpose for it, right? What about the tail? This is also a feature that is specifically suited for the particular environment in which the beaver lives. So the similarity between the beaver and Castorocauda is telling us that they lived in a similar environment. Think about this. Think about wings. Insects have wings, birds have wings, bats have wings, pterosaurs have wings. Are they all somehow more similar to each other because they have wings? Well, yes, but when we look at the larger pattern of life, they are actually very disparate organisms, right? Bats are mammals. They are genetically and morphologically more similar to other mammals, even though they have wings. Wings are another ecological specialization. They allow this particular mammal to fly. It turns out that these animals all need wings to fly, and thus wings aren't an important feature when we're trying to classify them in relationship to each other, because we know that the fact that they all have wings doesn't really have much relevance. They simply all have wings because they were all created to fly. So what we're seeing here is common design. God giving animals ecological specializations, or animals, through the genes that God has given them, expressing these ecological specializations, adapting to environments. So these particular features that indicate adaptation to a particular environment are often not useful in parsing out the grand pattern of life, because organisms independently have these characteristics. So in conclusion,
All right, I'm gonna deal with this for a minute. All right, I call this his the niche hypothesis. It's also one that's promoted by New Creation. I guess it's as promoted by them as a whole, because Christian Ryan also used this type of argument. Um, First of all, we actually don't know what kind of niche that this organism had at the time. You have to interpret that. He says, well, the webbed feet is good for paddling. That's true, but it also could be good for other things. Like in the case of the kangaroo, the webbed feet is good as a shock absorber for because it jumps everywhere. It's not intended to use as swimming. In fact, kangaroos are not known to be aquatic or semi-aquatic animals. They're good swimmers, but it had nothing to do with the web feet. It's just they paddle like a dog, from what I understand. And I haven't watched any videos on how they swim, but from what I understand, that they just kind of paddle. But they're good swimmers, but they're not known to be aquatic or even semi-aquatic animals. They don't live near water and things like that, and they don't make a point about going in the water and eating animals in water and that sort of thing. Um, so kangaroos don't use their webbed feet for that purpose. Now, a lot of animals that do have webbed feet do. Um, Now, what is my response to the niche hypothesis? He does try to connect it to the common design argument. I'll get to that in a few minutes. But what is my response to the niche hypothesis? Simply put, the niche hypothesis commits a fallacy in logic called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. It's also called the first cause fallacy. What is the post hoc ergo propter hoc? That is a Latin term. It means after this, therefore because of this. It assumes that point A came before point B, then point A caused point B. In this case, the argument would be that the environment impacted them to the point where they would have something that they would adapt to their particular environment. Now he argues for adaptation, but then he argues for common design, and I don't know how he's making that intermingle there. Um, uh, the common design argument is the argument that because God, because the same designer, common design, created all things, a common designer created all things, therefore, we would expect him to use similar materials in building everything, in creating. We would expect similar materials. And so, um, a life having similar functions would have similar biochemistry. We'd have similarity in purposes in cells and DNA and things like that. And so we would expect some similarity there. We would also expect some differences as well. And of course, we also are designed to adapt to our environment. So the argument is that because these particular features are used to adapt a particular environment, and because beavers and Castorocauda and other semi-aquatic animals share the that type of ecosystem, that type of environment, that this becomes a kind of an ecological adaptation. Either they adapted it, or God created them this way, or God created them with the ability to adapt in this way. Now, of course, in reality, this would not, for start with, there's nothing that says God would have to create something this way in order for it, for them to be, uh, 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 nothing logical that would say that God would have to create them this way in order for them to be semi-aquatic or aquatic. There are aquatic animals and semi-aquatic animals, lots and lots of aquatic and semi-aquatic animals that do not have webbed feet at all. And then there are many that do have webbed feet that do so on all 4 feet if they're mammals. And so there's nothing that says that a mammal can only have hind feet that are webbed, which there's only 3 mammals that I can find that have webbed hind feet. So and you can't apply this universally because there's animals that are not aquatic or semi-aquatic that have webbed feet, like in the case of kangaroos. So you can't apply this universally. I know what he's trying to do here, but you can't apply that universally. And it doesn't logically follow that God would have to create them like this. Now, what is the thing that he says about wings? That's kind of odd because wings have no ecological value. They're designed for survival. Okay, animals with wings, whether we're dealing with birds, bats, whatever. If we're dealing with something with wings, wings enable an animal to fly. That's kind of obvious, right? And the flight of an animal actually aids in 2 ways. One, to be able to make it easier for them to catch catch prey and food, and be able to do that and find food. And the second thing is for survival, because it's easier to escape a predator on ground if you are able to fly and that sort of thing. And so that helps with survival as well. It's there's nothing evolving ecological because you've got animals that can fly in a wide variety of ecological systems and ecosystems and that sort of thing. Bats in caves, for example, they're not even in the open environment. They're in a very closed area, enclosed area. So that makes no sense. Wings have no ecological value whatsoever. They got survival value to them. Find food, escape predators. It's all about survival, and that's why animals that have wings have wings. But even that doesn't follow logically that they have to have wings for survival because other animals have other ways in which they survive. So it doesn't follow that. So his logic here is simply to assume that the reason why beavers and Castorocauda share similar features is because they share an ecosystem. You don't know what ecosystem either one. You know where beavers share because we have beavers in a modern world, but you don't know what Castorocauda did. Unless you can take a time machine back in the past, you have no idea what ecosystem it have. You're assuming it shared an ecosystem with water because of the behind feet are webbed, and that's fine. I'm okay with that interpretation. That's an assumption, but it might be a reasonable assumption. Most animals with webbed feet are usually aquatic or semi-aquatic in some way. So I'm okay with that interpretation, but it's still an interpretation. It's still an assumption that you're applying to the evidence. Um, but it would not be necessarily that you have to have webbed feet or have to have hind webbed feet or in order to be semi-aquatic. So it's very possible for two different animals to share the same ecosystem and not have the same characteristics. In fact, given the fact, if you were just basing that on creatures that live today, how many animals have webbed feet? How many animals of mammals? How many mammals have webbed feet? How many mammals have webbed hind feet? Only the for the later, only three that I found. All three being rodents. And so you can't really make that niche hypothesis work because it argues a fallacy in logic essentially, and then you try to connect it to the common design argument. All YACs believe in common design, absolutely, um, and but he in the combination of common design, he combines it. He combines common design with adaptation, which adaptation and common design are not exactly the same thing. Common design just means that God created the organism in such a way that it would hold similarities for whatever purpose or whatnot. Adaptation has to do with the flexibility of the genetic code that God front loaded a particular animal with, that it's able to adapt to its environment based on its available genetic information. So, in other words, you can isolate the genes in such a way that it would actually adapt and learn to adapt to that particular environment. And that's fine if you want to believe it did that. But when it comes to shared characteristics, you can't just simply overlook that and say, oh, well, it's common. Because guess what? Guess what the person who thinks this is a beaver could do? He could then argue in reverse. He could say the only reason there are differences is because that was not adaptationally. It doesn't have a lot of advantage. They could argue that it does not have a lot of advantage to do it that way, to have an actual strategic advantage, and therefore it adapted these differences to accommodate. Now they're making the same fallacy if they do that, but here's the thing: if you're going to argue that, then you could also argue the reverse, and they can explain the differences because of the environment, because of the situation, the adaptation, and that sort of thing. I don't think you can make the niche hypothesis stick very well, because how do you determine animals today? I mean, he spent most of the video looking at differences and then arguing that those differences means it wasn't that animal. And now he's saying, oh, well, the reason it has these shared similarities is because it shares the same ecosystem. Um, Maybe there's something in the environment at the time that would prevent those it to having the exact same similarities in every respect. You can't really make the niche hypothesis work very well, I don't think. It does make the first cause fallacy there, the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. It does not logically mean it'll have to. And there's lots and lots of examples of both aquatic and semi-aquatic animals, and even animals that are not aquatic or semi-aquatic that could have similar features. And they could be repurposed for different reasons. And so, like the kangaroos use their red feet for shock absorbers. They're not aquatic animals. And there are animals that are aquatic and semi-aquatic, so they don't have these features at all. So you can apply this universally, regardless. Okay, let's see if Peter's going to finish up here.
Conclusion, beavers are not living fossils. They're not related to Castorocauda.
All right, he says that beavers are not living fossils. That is false. First of all, beavers do actually exist, uh, and they have actually been found in the fossil record. I've actually found one recently. Um, I think they called it Bucky. I think it's like A Bucky. The A stands for like this long Latin name. I don't remember what it's pronounced, but I remember it as A Bucky. They actually named it after a mascot named Bucky that dressed up like a beaver, that sort of thing. And this is a beaver that's found in the fossil strata. It's not found in the Jurassic strata, but it's found in the strata. It's been found in the fossil. So yeah, technically speaking, you can classify this as a living fossil. It just wouldn't be a living fossil that's been found with dinosaur fossils or something like that. But the reality is that it's not that beavers are living fossils. It's whether Castorocauda is a living fossil or not. That's the issue. Is Castorocauda a living fossil or not a living fossil? I don't know why he is arguing, well, beavers aren't living fossils. Well, beavers is not in question here, whether it's a living fossil. We know that we have fossils of beavers in the fossil strata. The issue is whether Castorocauda is a living fossil or not. But even if it's not, it's irrelevant. Both all YECs, and I think maybe Peter too, agree that beavers lived at the same time as dinosaurs. The title of the video is "Did Beavers Really Live with Dinosaurs?" which is kind of weird. If this was coming from evolutionists, I would assume that the person is arguing in the negative. But instead, this is coming from a YC, and young Earth creationists do believe that beavers and dinosaurs existed at the same time. So I'm not entirely certain why he worded that way, other than maybe just to echo uh, the controversy. But beavers are not on subject whether they are a living fossil, because if you classify it that way, then they would be considered a living fossil because we have beavers around today, and we also have beavers in the fossil strata. There have been beaver fossils that have been found, so it's not really a big deal. It's just a matter of whether they're found in the fossil strata alongside dinosaurs or whatnot. Um, but the issue really isn't whether beavers are a living fossil, it's whether Castorocauda is a living fossil or not. So he kind of words the debate a little bit odd to me.
And more generally speaking, modern mammal groups do not appear in rock layers alongside dinosaurs.
This is incorrect. I think they label like 400 and something that have been found. They label them as, classify them as mammaliforms, which they try to deny them as mammals, but a lot of that is just based on the evolutionary presuppositions and so forth. Just because he kind of makes a general comment because even if let's say Castorocauda, for the sake of argument, wasn't a beaver, okay? Let's say that was the case. Would that mean that the other living fossils aren't living fossils that appear alongside dinosaur fossils? No, it wouldn't. He would literally have to go one by one in each of the fossils and try to disprove them. Good luck. And there are some fossils, by the way, even if you go outside the mammals, living fossils of mammals, there are also living fossils that are not mammals. And of course, there's living fossils with much better evidence than even Castorocauda, way much better evidence. Like, for example, the Nautilus, animal that was found there. Carl Werner actually was able to see a cut up opening of that, and he could show you the pictures of each of the half. Cut open the actual modern day nautilus as well as the fossil of the nautilus like animal, and show that it does match that of a modern day nautilus. You can see that, and so it's clearly a living fossil. So whether Castorocauda is or not is one thing. It's one thing to try to answer that question because you don't have to answer whether Castorocauda is a living fossil. But if you're going to argue from that and say that all living fossils aren't living fossils, then you're going to need a case by case basis, in which case you're going to have to argue every one of them. And there's about like 400 something of the, in terms of the mammal like animals, and that have been found. And so, good luck with that, Peter, if you want to take on that endeavor. But any given case, I don't think you could try to go from whether Castorocauda was a living fossil or not to assume that no living fossils existed or not. That would be a hasty generalization fallacy.
Mammal-like creatures that do appear alongside the dinosaurs are quite distinct from their ecologically similar counterparts.
Um, we don't know that. The fossil evidence for docudontids are very, very limited, like mostly to skull fragments. There could be other things besides skull fragments, but from what I understand, they're not very um, uh, well preserved. Um, that's what think about it. The most distinguished feature of a donkadonta, is the molars. So that should tell you something. You think that there would be a list of distinguishable features, right? But they're not because it's not. Most of the time they're not very well preserved. So that's why they say molars, because usually the skull of the donkadonta is the one that's more preserved than the other stuff. And so uh, I would argue that that's not correct. That's assuming that they're not mammals. That's taking an evolutionary view and applying it. You don't know that they're not a man, and I'm surprised that there are YECs that do that, but there is a small group of YECs that seem to be sympathetic with evolutionary interpretation. I don't know whether Peter is or not. If you guys understand Peter's position or beliefs on things like feathered dinosaurs and walking whales and things like that, let me know in the comment section because I don't know Peter very well. I don't know. I only had recent interaction with Peter, so I don't know what his positions on these things are or where he's coming from on it. So if some of you guys might be more familiar with Peter's stuff, maybe you could throw it in the comment section and let me know where he stands on some of these issues and why he seems so sympathetic to some evolutionary interpretations of things. I don't know why, but any given case. Bottom line is that I don't think you can make that assessment from what we've heard today. Um, uh, and Dr. Donknitz, there's very little evidence of, we they're not very well preserved. And so what we do have of it, we know what its mouth looks like pretty much, or the jaw and that sort of thing. That's fine. But the molars are very different from that of Castorocauda. But I would say dogodontids probably are mammals, but there's no way to know for sure because we don't have uh, enough evidence to say one way or the other in terms of the way we classify mammals today, at least. And of course, keep in mind, just because we classify things today, group them a certain way, don't mean that's the way they should be grouped. That's the Isalk fallacy. Well, that's all I have for you today. I usually don't respond to other young Earth creationists. I try not to. It's not my forte. It's not something I would rather do. But I kind of got involved in this in kind of like a ricochet. Like I got involved with the response video to Dr. Dove because he responded to one of my videos, and I did a 3-part response to him. And then um, I wrote an article on my website, which Peter responds to, and then he ended up making his own video. After watching that, I end up responding to it. So, but anyway, moving ahead, I'm hoping that I won't have to deal with this subject matter anymore. Peter doesn't strike me as the kind to try to go back and forth for a very extended period of time. He might throw out a comment and then I'll probably respond, and then that's probably going to be it. And then we move on. I'm glad because I don't want to deal with this subject matter anymore. I want to kind of move on from it. Next week, which will probably be the week that this will be uploaded, I also have an interview with Dr. Jerry Bergman on Neanderthals, a very big discussion over the course of Neanderthals that we're going to have with Dr. Jerry Bergman, because that is going to uh, be part of my Are We Apes series. So I can't wait for that. And the following week on the 18th, I've got a live interview via StreamYard with Jennifer Niza. So we're finally going to be doing our interview there. Hopefully there won't be no cancellations this time. I'm really looking forward to it. I can't wait. And let me know what you think in the comment section. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Give the video a thumbs up, share it with others, and I, I will see you on the next one. Until next time, stay in the know.